Are there questions about any of the models or about multi-stakeholder in particular?
Yes, actually, we do have a question here from Jeff online.
Okay.
The question is, if a worker member wants to leave the worker co-op, what happens to their shares? That is, would it be possible to keep one's shares in the co-op in the event they need to leave?
With worker cooperatives and all types of cooperatives, the requirement is that if anyone leaves the membership, the cooperative buys those shares back. And so it is possible. There are two, and we'll talk a bit about the different types of shares a little bit later in the presentation, but there are two types of shares available in Ontario. There are membership shares and there are preference shares. Membership shares are the shares that have voting rights attached to them, and you have to have membership shares in order to be considered a member. It is possible for non-members to buy preference shares in cooperatives. Some co-ops choose not to allow this. They only allow members to invest in the cooperative, but some choose to allow outside investment. So it's possible that a member that is leaving the cooperative would need to, their member shares would be bought out, but they may retain their preference shares. This may not be permitted by the cooperative, but generally, whenever a member leaves the cooperative, their shares or member loans are redeemed by the cooperative. The only time this doesn't happen is if it would put the cooperative at financial risk for them to buy those shares back. But generally, if you're leaving the membership, at a minimum, your member shares are being redeemed, and that's to reflect the fact that if you're no longer a member, you no longer have voting rights, and so your membership shares can no longer be in your possession if you're not considered a member any longer. But if the cooperative does allow for outside investors to have preference shares invested in your cooperative, it is possible that you could retain those shares. And again, that would be a decision of the cooperative when they're setting up their structure. So I hope that answers that question. And we'll get a bit more into the concept of shares and loans a bit later in the presentation. Are there other questions at this point around the models?
If you have a preference share in a worker co-op, you have to work definitely, or you can just have a preference share without working? You
can just have a preference share. The idea is that membership shares are what denote membership, and so in order to be a member in a worker cooperative, there's usually an employment requirement, similar to, in order to hold membership in any type of cooperative, you need to meet the membership criteria. So not just worker cooperatives, but in order to be a member of Gay Leaf Foods, you need to be a dairy farmer because you're going to have to sell milk to the cooperative. And if you don't meet those requirements, you can't be a member. But if they were in a position where they were selling outside preference shares to outsiders, you could potentially purchase those. But again, not all cooperatives permit this. And it's a decision of the cooperative whether or not who they sell their preference shares to. But in order to hold membership shares and be considered a member, you also have to meet the membership criteria. In the case of a worker cooperative, that would mean some sort of employment relationship as defined by the cooperative. Who's going to work for this cooperative and how is that defined?
Okay, thank you.
We have a question here from online. How do you assess what a membership share is worth?
That's a great question. Membership shares are going to depend on a couple of different factors. They're going to depend on what the financial needs of the cooperative are. How much money does the cooperative need to raise? And knowing that there are preference shares that are available for raising those funds can make that easier. The other thing is you're going to want to set your membership shares at a level so that the people that you are trying to attract as members can reasonably afford it. And so, for example, you don't necessarily want to set your member shares very high because that would be a barrier for some people to become members. And this isn't just about shares. This would be for membership fees as well. So any sort of, and we'll get into a bit more of that distinction in a moment, but you want to find a level that's going to allow the ease of recruitment that you need, but is also going to generate the equity in the cooperative that you need to, if you need to be purchasing equipment, if you need to be, generating a certain amount of money to allow you to begin operations, if you need to pay for some inventory or something like that. So some of this depends on business needs of the cooperative, but it also depends on what you're going to want in terms of your member recruitment. So there might be some rules of thumb based on sector. So for example, some cooperatives with very high capital requirements are going to be quite different than a co-op that maybe doesn't have that same high level. Where if you're talking about buying a processing facility or buying a lot of equipment, your capital needs are going to be quite different than a smaller co-op that is simply looking to rent space in a building somewhere. So again, this is a bit of a case-by-case basis.